Hi, I'm Peter Ryan. Welcome to this week's episode of the CX Files. Customer experience management takes on many forms and depends heavily on the sector in which consumers are being supported. Now, one of the industries that's gone under the radar traditionally has been energy and utilities, but as deregulation and the demand for greener alternatives have moved forward, so too has the need for better CX outcomes. Today on the CX Files, we learn more about what's at play in the energy market from a customer experience perspective from Stuart Ravens, a veteran analyst in the energy world and the founder of Corax Insights, based in London. Stuart Ravens, welcome to the CX Files. Thanks for taking some time to chat with us today.
Thanks, Peter. It's good to be with you.
Well, it's great to be with you. And it's great to be touching on a topic that I think is really hitting home for a lot of members of the CX community, and that's the extent to which the energy and utility sector is evolving. Now, probably as a good starting point would be to find out from you the extent to which you feel that energy providers have handled customer experience, the customer experience side of their business up until today. What would be some of the key dynamics that you've observed over the years?
Sure. I mean, well, let's take it back over the years because I've looked at the energy industry for well over a decade, and I think if we go back to the early years of this century, utilities really lagged behind other industries in their approach to customer experience. Certainly in the US, most customers or most utilities would refer to their customers as ratepayers. Mm-hmm. So they weren't even thought of as customers. And speaking anecdotally, some utilities actually went out of their way to minimize the amount of contact that they'd have with their customers. And that has changed significantly. So the industry, while not perfect and certainly lagging behind most other industries in terms of their approach to customer experience, are actually doing about as much as they can with the resources that are made available to them. And it really does change where in the world you're looking because, there is no energy industry. Energy markets are very different. I mean, you only have to look at the United States and you have, thousands of utilities working within 50 different regulators because it's all at the state level, even different networks that are islanded from each other. So one of the big differences between different kinds of utility organizations is whether it's a competitive market, which the US utilities call a deregulated market, or whether it's a monopoly or a regulated market. But even in the monopoly markets, utilities have vastly improved their approach to customers. That's largely been driven by regulators and this was kind of pre-2007 when energy prices were starting to increase and we had record price per barrel of oil. There was a subsequent increase in electricity prices. And that led a lot of customers to start looking at their electricity bills, starting to scrutinize them, expecting more from their utility providers as they were paying more. And that really sharpened regulators' focus on utilities' performance, just making sure that they're billing accurately and serving customers to kind of the levels that they were should be expected to from other industries. So there's the thing called the JD Power surveys, which most people will be well aware of. They've become the kind of de facto benchmark for utility customer service performance in the US. Added to that is, when we talk about the utility industry, when I first, as I said, we're going back a decade or more. When I first started looking at the utility industry, within the first week, someone said to me, look at the energy trilemma. And this trilemma, it's still as relevant today, if not more relevant today than it was kind of 13, 14 years ago. And the trilemma is really quite simple. It's how does a utility deliver reliable, cheap and green electricity? Because ultimately you can achieve two of those quite easily, and three, it's a lot harder. And everything kind of like pulls back to that energy trilemma. But the shift towards renewables is, inexorable now. There's no argument about it. The economics of solar and wind are such that it's cheaper than in most places in the world. It's cheaper than any other form of generation. It'll be the one that's picked. But it comes with some huge issues. But shifting towards renewables. And allowing customers to choose more greener tariffs, and the creation of loads of new business models that are more focused around providing and supplying customers with green energy has really sharpened the focus, irrespective of what kind of market you sit in. But it's really focusing utilities more on customer outcomes, which has never really been done before.
But Stuart, that raises a really interesting question when we're talking about green energy alternatives, and I think we can all agree that these are under heavy demand in Western Europe, North America, and many, many other markets around the world. You're right when you talk about the shift being towards outcomes. How do these energy organizations, as they're bringing new green products or services to the market, keep customer experience as a mainstay of being able to be environmentally friendly while at the same time consumer friendly?
Yeah, I think that's it's relatively easy to do because one great example that I use and use this as kind of like a case in point, Austin Electricity. So in Texas, it serves the Austin municipal area. It's one of those forward-thinking US utilities, and certainly one of the first that I saw to embrace electric vehicles. So electric vehicles, I mean, this is transport. It's not actually power supply, but Austin Energy has really got behind a push for electric vehicles. And jump on its website. It's part of its Plug-in Austin program. You'll see it's a great website because the customer experience of the website itself is pretty poor. Clearly they don't spend a lot of money on web design. What they have spent a lot of money on is actually designing a product that serves customer requirements for the future, and the future obviously is the electrification of vehicles. So what does it do? I mean, there's a whole raft of different options. There's an EV buyer's guide. It helps you install an EV charger for a discount. It has special EV charging tariffs, so you get super cheap electricity to charge your car overnight. When demand for power is much lower. It's installed its own charging stations across Austin, so you can pay a flat fee of just over $4 a month, and you can charge your car as many times as you like across over 1,000 charge points that It's installed. It's installed fast charging points, so they're outside of that program, but you can pay, I think it's 20 cents a minute for those super fast charging ports. So they've done lots. They recognise that electric vehicles, it's a once in a generation opportunity for utilities to increase the amount of power that's being used in their service territory. And they're looking at ways of, they went out at an early stage and started talking to their customers. What do you actually need from electric vehicles? So that was really customer focused, and the voice of the customer really drove their strategy.
So looking at a little broader, from a 40,000 foot view, when it comes to energy consumption, what are consumers most concerned with when they're choosing a provider if they're in a deregulated market? And what would you say would be some of the bugbears that energy and utilities providers would need to try and avoid in order to retain as many consumers as possible? And I love what you said, they're no longer rate payers, they're consumers. And this is a real shift in mindset, in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that we have to remember is that when, over the last, and really we're talking about the last 30 years of this refocusing of power utilities as markets have been deregulated, competition has been introduced. The utility, and certainly I think it's most appropriate to talk about the European markets there, where competition has been introduced across all of those European markets. Most of those providers that are out there active in the market are the old utilities of the middle of the 20th century that were government owned and throughout this transition have found it quite difficult to stop acting as though they were government owned. So, there's an aging workforce is an issue within the utilities, but one of the consequences of that is when a lot of these employees first started working for the utilities, they were government owned utilities. So there's a kind of a mindset, but there's also that legacy infrastructure. And I'm talking less about the physical networks, be they pipes or wires, but the technology infrastructure has all had to been updated. And that's been a huge barrier for most utilities. And it's that legacy technology infrastructure that's really leads to most bugbears for utility customers, because these aren't catch-rich companies. They can't just go out and invest in the latest technologies. And when you're running a billing cycle for 10, 15, 20 million customers every month, that's a huge undertaking for your IT. And you can't just rip and replace it with software every 6 months. It's hundreds of millions of dollars to make those changes. So you're talking about highly expensive IT projects for companies operating on very slim margins. So when you take that into account, it does. That provides you with a context of what are the big bugbears for customers. It's getting the bills wrong. I mean, customers don't really care too much about their utilities. There's very little brand affinity for your power provider.
Yeah.
And necessarily so. It is a utility. We only notice it when it's not there.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to notice your utility when all you're doing is just switching the lights on. So it's quality of service, so providing me with power when I want that power. It comes back to the trilemma. It's power when I want that power. It's at an affordable price, and increasingly it's renewable. And the most successful utilities are the ones that try and focus on all of those. Typically, if you have a renewable tariff, you end up paying more for your power, but then utilities are also starting to innovate with different tariffs. For example, my provider, now I've got a smart meter, I can peg my bill to match wholesale prices, because wholesale prices going to peaks and troughs throughout the day. Sure. Most utilities charge a flat rate.
Yeah.
So there's that flexibility, there's innovation around pricing. But the other bugbears are obviously in the contact center. So the inability to address issues as and when they arise, not quickly resolving issues which probably should be resolved quickly. And that's down to technology, resourcing, educating utility service agents.
It's really interesting that you bring that up, because certainly in the contact center sphere, I know that many of the energy companies have really been beefing up their game when it comes to engagement. As you say, people don't notice their utilities until there's a problem. And if there's a power outage in a particular neighborhood or a community, very quickly they're going to need to ramp up and make sure that the people who are effectively representing them on the telephones or digital channels are going to have the most information at hand in order to triage the situation and to reassure the consumer that the power will be back up at some point in the immediate future. But that raises a really interesting question about the utilities and energy sector as we go into 2021. Obviously, the past 12 months have been some of the more peculiar that we've all experienced, no matter where we might be in the world. What do you see as the main business drivers for the energy sector as it relates to how they're dealing with the consumers? And what do you see as the key customer experience strategies they're going to need to deploy moving forward in order to not just retain the consumers they have, but to actually grow their markets?
So I'll take a step back, and it's going to be a long answer, but you can probably tell I'm talking. So in the late 80s, there was a huge environmental campaign. Then we hit a global recession. Everyone forgot about the environment. It was all about protecting jobs, because kind of the environment was a nice to have. I don't think anyone really appreciated 30 years ago, quite how bad climate change was actually going to be. If we then go back to 2007, the environmental campaign leading up to that had a voice, and it maintained that voice through kind of the what we called the credit crunch. And I don't think the volume was necessarily turned down, but no one really focused in too much on sustainability. There were development funds made available. I think the US was a great example of a country that directed stimulus funding at the energy industry, not only to stimulate jobs, but to create a cleaner environment. Smart metering, for example, made a big part of Barack Obama's ARA funding program. And I think there was something like $4 billion was made available for research and demonstration projects into smart metering, smart grid, and renewable power. I think what we're seeing now in terms of the COVID downturn is not just the fact that the volume's staying level, the volume's increasing. You look at countries like South Korea, for example, which has been a laggard in terms of the adoption of green technology. That's actually front and center of its stimulus program, is to invest more in green power. We've seen the Biden administration really ramping up its efforts in green technology, and it really is stimulus funding that's going in there. It's to create clean energy jobs within the US and Europe. There's been no deceleration in terms of green investment, other than during COVID. Obviously, with the lockdown, it's delayed a lot of some of the building out of green energy infrastructure, as you'd expect. But I expect this to be dialed up a lot more in the future. It's about cleaning the planet. Most voters, recognize that there's a serious issue that needs to be addressed, and the energy system has to do that. And we've seen wave after wave of new clean generation technologies being introduced. It was wind, it was solar, lithium-ion batteries, and now we're looking at a hydrogen economy. What this actually means for the customer, well, actually, it turns everything on its head. Electric vehicles in the US particularly is an interesting case in point. if you look at the way the grid has been built within the US, you have quite small transformers that serve just a handful of houses for most of the US network infrastructure. In Europe, it's different. We have larger transformers that serve 200-300 houses. In the US, electric vehicles can put an awful lot of strain on customers' houses. Now, if an unintended consequence of pushing people towards electric vehicles could cause some really serious problems for utilities. Now, if there are a lot of outages that are caused basically by people going out and buying electric vehicles, and utilities think that they have 20 years to rebuild their infrastructure, they're in for a nasty shock. Because what will happen? People start generating their own power, putting solar on their roofs, having an electric vehicle, an electric vehicle on their drive, a stationary battery in their property somewhere, and basically they island themselves from the network. So what utilities really need to do is engage with their customers, build out these energy services rather than just thinking of themselves as energy suppliers. And that's really part of the energy transition, and a lot of utilities really focusing their long-term strategies on service rather than supply.
Great stuff. Well, Stuart, this has been a fascinating piercing into the energy and utilities sector, one that I don't think from a CX standpoint necessarily gets as much attention as it deserves, but hopefully in 2021 and beyond, that will change. Some very, very fascinating elements that you brought to the table. Thanks so much for taking some time to be on the CX Files, and we look forward to having you back.
Cheers, Peter. Anytime.
Thanks for downloading the CX Files podcast. If you have a moment, please give us a star rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, because this really helps other people to find the podcast. If you have any suggestions for future guests, or ideas, people or topics, then please just find myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan on LinkedIn and send a suggestion.